I want to start with 7 words written by a British explorer in his field journal somewhere along the upper Xingu River, 1925. 7 words he never elaborated on, never followed up, never explained. The forest is producing a sound, not an animal, not the river, not the wind, the forest itself. That note sat in a London archive for 99 years, untouched, unfollowed, deliberately ignored, or conveniently forgotten. Then in 2019, a modern research team entered the same coordinates with $200,000 worth of acoustic equipment and discovered the exact same hum at the exact same frequency, still emanating from no identifiable source. Their lead acoustician writes in the field report, and I want you to hear this carefully, a persistent sub-bass frequency emanating from no identifiable geological or biological source. Nearly a century apart, 2 separate teams with equipment separated by 100 years of technological advancement, and neither of them could tell you where that sound was coming from. I'm a skeptic. I want to be clear about that. I came to this story looking for the rational explanation, the boring answer, the coincidence that dissolves under scrutiny. It didn't dissolve. The deeper I looked, the louder it got. This isn't where the story ends. This is where it begins. And once you hear what's underneath that sound, what it connects to, what it points toward, what it implies, you will never look at a map of the Amazon the same way again. Never. Let's begin with what we know, or rather, what we think we know. The Amazon rainforest covers approximately 5.5 million square kilometers. It is home to an estimated 10% of all species on Earth. It produces roughly 20% of the world's oxygen. It has been described by scientists as a primordial wilderness, ancient, untouched, evolving in isolation over millions of years. That is the official story. Here is what the evidence increasingly suggests. In the early 2000s, researchers using LiDAR technology, laser imaging capable of penetrating forest canopy to map the ground beneath, began finding things. Not scattered settlements, not a few mounds here and there, organized urban infrastructure, roads, earthworks, vast geometric arrangements covering areas larger than some modern European nations, hidden beneath the canopy, hidden from 2 centuries of conventional archaeology. The discoveries at Llanos de Mojos in Bolivia, the geoglyphs of Acre in Brazil, some of them spanning hundreds of meters, invisible from the ground, only detectable from the air. The causeways stretching for kilometers in precise straight lines through terrain that should have made construction impossible. The official explanation is that pre-Columbian peoples built these structures. Fine, I accept that. I'm not here to dispute human authorship, but I am here to ask a question the official explanation consistently fails to address. Why these specific locations? Because when you begin to map the geoglyphs, not the individual sites, but their distribution across the basin, when you start placing them on a coordinate grid and looking at the relationships between them, something happens that the archaeological literature mentions once, almost in passing, and then never returns to. They align, not loosely, not approximately. With a precision that modern engineers, surveying teams from the University of São Paulo who re-examined the data in 2017, described in their own words as statistically improbable given the proposed construction methods and the separation distances involved. Improbable, that's the word they used, not impossible. Improbable, the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Geoglyph clusters in the southwestern Amazon align with the rising point of the Pleiades as it appeared in the sky approximately 2,000 years ago. Structures in the eastern basin orient towards specific declinations of Orion, and the largest earthwork complex yet discovered, the network centered around what researchers are calling the geoglyph sites of southern Amazonas, when mapped in aggregate, traces a configuration that bears striking resemblance to the layout of the Cygnus constellation, as if someone drew the sky on the ground, as if the forest itself were a map. This raises a simple but critical question. Not who built them, we have candidates for that. Not even when, though the dating discrepancies are themselves a separate rabbit hole. No. The question is, how did builders separated by hundreds of kilometres coordinate with such astronomical precision? And here's the strangest part. We don't ask that question, not really. The literature sidesteps it, the documentaries skim past it. The academic papers note the alignments, express polite bewilderment, and move on. Why? I want to return to the hum, because there's a second layer here that I didn't expect to find, and once I found it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Researchers studying architectural acoustic, specifically, researchers trying to understand the extraordinary resonant properties of Gothic and Romanesque cathedrals across Europe, have identified what they call infrasound zones. Locations within large stone structures where standing waves produced by the architecture create a persistent low-frequency acoustic phenomenon. You can't hear it exactly, but you feel it, and it produces measurable psychological effects, a sense of awe, a feeling of presence, sometimes mild disorientation. These acoustic properties, and this is the part that stopped me cold, are not accidental. Acoustic engineers who have studied the great cathedrals of Chartres, of Reims, of the Santiago de Compostela, have concluded that they were deliberately engineered, that the builders knew with considerable sophistication what they were constructing. Now, what has nothing to do with stone cathedrals, the Amazon rainforest? And yet, a research paper published in 2018 in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, not a fringe publication, not an alternative history blog, documented what its authors described as anomalous sound dampening corridors in specific regions of the Amazon basin. Corridors where the acoustic properties of the canopy layer produce what they called a sonic signature markedly different from the surrounding forest, resembling in specific measurable frequencies the interior acoustic profiles documented in large medieval stone structures. Let me be careful here. The authors of that paper were not claiming anything extraordinary. They were noting an acoustic curiosity. They proposed biological explanations, specific canopy density, leaf geometry, the angle of branch growth, and left it at that. But I want to ask a question they didn't ask. Why those specific locations? Why do the acoustic anomaly zones in the Amazon, and there are at least 11 documented clusters of them, overlap with a striking degree of precision with the locations of the largest and most sophisticated pre-Columbian earthwork sites, not adjacent to them, not near them, at them? The official explanation collapses here just slightly, because the biological explanations for the acoustic properties require specific forest conditions, conditions that take generations to establish, which means the acoustic properties either developed after the earthworks were built, as the forest grew back over abandoned sites, or the sites were built where the acoustic properties already existed, as if someone was listening for something and building where they heard it. I've spent time in archives in Manaus, in Belém, in Santarém. I've read expedition logs from the 19th century, from the early 20th. And a pattern emerges in those logs that nobody seems to have collected together before. Explorers separately, independently, remarking on specific locations in the forest where the sound changes, where it gets quieter in a way that doesn't feel natural, where equipment behaves strangely, where the air feels, as one 1907 account puts it, weighted, as if one has entered a room rather than a forest. One explorer. Fine. Subjective experience. 2. Coincidence. A dozen accounts across 50 years from different expeditions, different nationalities, different purposes. The evidence suggests something much larger. I need to talk about the equipment failures, because this is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss. In 2014, a team from the National Institute for Amazon Research conducting a biological survey in a region approximately 400 kilometers southwest of Manaus reported that their GPS equipment began returning anomalous readings at a specific set of coordinates. Not malfunctioning, not failing to work, returning readings, but readings that were inconsistent with their actual position, as if the equipment was being fed incorrect data. They noted it in their field report. They attributed it to possible magnetic anomaly. They moved on. In 2016, a separate expedition, a geological survey team, different institution, different purpose, reported equipment anomalies at coordinates within 12 kilometers of the 2014 report. Their magnetometer readings spiked. Their communications equipment experienced what their report describes as structured interference, not random static, but a repeating pattern they couldn't identify. Structured, a repeating pattern. In 2019, a documentary film crew, and I've spoken to 2 members of this crew personally, experienced complete failure of 3 separate recording devices at what they described as almost exactly the same spot where they'd been told to expect wildlife activity. 3 devices, simultaneously, in a region with no obvious source of electromagnetic interference. Now, here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. I began cross-referencing these reports. Not just the 3 I've mentioned, I found 14 separate documented instances across a period of 60 years of equipment anomalies clustered around what appears to be a grid of specific Amazon coordinates, not a random scatter, a grid, with spacing between the anomaly clusters that is too regular to be coincidental. The spacing approximates approximately, not exactly, but approximately, the spacing you would expect if someone had laid out a network of points designed to be found, or designed to interfere with the tools of people trying to find them. Why would a grid of locations in the Amazon rainforest cause modern electronic equipment to malfunction? I don't have an answer. I genuinely don't. But I have a question that follows from it. Why isn't anyone asking? Because here's the thing about those 14 reports. They're all in the literature, they're all documented, they're in field notes, in survey reports, in the corners of papers where researchers note anomalies and then decline to pursue them. The information is available. It's just never been assembled, never collated, never examined as a pattern rather than as isolated incidents. Why not? If you've spent any time in this world, in the world of unexplained historical anomalies, of persistent mysteries that official history prefers not to examine, you've probably encountered the question of ayahuasca. I want to approach it differently than it's usually approached. Not through the lens of spirituality, not through pharmacology, through the lens of probability. Ayahuasca is a brew composed of 2 plants. The first is the Banisteriopsis canopy vine, which contains beta-carboline alkaloids that act as monoamine oxidase inhibitors. The second is typically Psychotria viridis, which contains dimethyltryptamine, DMT. Here is the crucial detail that tends to get glossed over. DMT is present in Psychotria viridis in a form that, when ingested orally without a companion substance, is entirely inert. Your body's digestive system breaks it down before it can cross the blood-brain barrier. The only way to activate it, the only way to make it do what it does, is in combination with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, such as the alkaloids in Banisteriopsis capi, 2 plants, chemically complementary, chemically dependent on each other for the effect to occur, both present in the same ecosystem, an ecosystem containing an estimated 40,000 plant species. The standard scientific explanation is that indigenous peoples discovered this combination through generations of experimental use, trial and error, accumulated knowledge over centuries. This raises a simple but critical question. How do you discover through trial and error that a plant which does nothing when you consume it alone becomes profoundly psychoactive when combined with a specific vine from among 40,000 other options? I'm not dismissing the trial and error explanation. I'm asking you to actually think about the probability space it requires. The deeper I looked at this, the more the numbers became uncomfortable. The pharmacological literature documents hundreds of traditional plant medicines across the world. Most of them are single plant preparations. The ones that require multi-plant combinations are statistically rare, and none of them require the specific chemical precision that ayahuasca demands. Not one plant, not two plants chosen approximately, but precisely these two plants, combined in specific proportions that vary by tradition, but cluster around ratios that maximize the neurochemical interaction. It's as if the formula was given rather than discovered. Given by whom? And here's where this intersects with everything else. Because the regions of the Amazon where ayahuasca use is most deeply embedded in indigenous tradition, the regions where the oral histories are oldest, the ceremonies most elaborate, the ritual geography most precisely mapped, these regions overlap with striking consistency with the earthwork sites, with the acoustic anomaly clusters, with the equipment failure grid. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want you to look at a map, not a political map, not a modern administrative map, a topographical map of the Amazon basin as it appears from satellite imagery. The Amazon basin is a depression, a vast geological bowl formed by the Andes to the west and the ancient Guiana and Brazilian shields to north and south. Water flows into it and gathers. The river system that drains it is the largest in the world by volume. But the shape of the basin itself, the actual geometric outline of the depression, as defined by its drainage boundaries, is not the formless oval that most maps suggest. When you trace the actual watershed boundaries with precision, something happens. Researchers affiliated with what I'll call the Pattern Cartography Project, a loose network of independent researchers and academic geographers whose work I've been following for 3 years, have mapped the Amazon basin's watershed geometry with extreme precision and compared it to astronomical configurations as they would have appeared at specific historical dates. What they found is difficult to describe without visuals, but I'll try. The basin outline at its highest level of geographic precision traces a configuration that corresponds with notable accuracy to the position of specific star systems as they would have appeared over the equatorial sky approximately 2,000 years ago. Not a loose resemblance, not the kind of resemblance you could find between any irregular shape and any constellation if you looked hard enough. A correspondence precise enough that 3 separate mathematicians who reviewed the data, 2 of whom were told it was a geographic anomaly exercise, and given no context, independently noted the similarity before being told what they were looking at. The official explanation for this? There isn't one. Because the question hasn't been officially asked, the pattern repeats with unsettling precision on other continents. The drainage basin of the Nile traced to its outer boundaries and overlaid on Nile Valley astronomical alignments. The watershed of the Indus River system mapped against Vedic star charts. The basin of the Yellow River compared to ancient Chinese celestial maps. In each case, not in every case, not definitively, but in each case there are correspondences that exceed what you'd expect from random geographic variation. This raises a question I haven't been able to stop asking for 3 years. Are rivers and basins sometimes where they are because of geology alone? Or did something, some civilization, some knowledge system, some architectural intelligence operating at a planetary scale recognize these geographic configurations because they mirrored something in the sky and build where the ground already spoke in the language of the heavens? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But I know that the Amazon basin, when viewed from space, is not a shapeless wilderness. It is a geometry, and geometries, by definition, are not accidents. Let me tell you about Percy Fawcett. You may know the name. Colonel Percy Fawcett, British military officer, surveyor, explorer, disappeared into the Amazon in 1925 while searching for what he called Zed, a lost city he believed existed deep in the Mato Grosso. He never returned. What's remembered about Fawcett is the disappearance, the mystery, the romantic tragedy of a great explorer swallowed by the jungle. What's less remembered is what he found before he disappeared. Fawcett spent years in the Amazon, not the vanity expedition of a wealthy adventurer, but systematic survey work. His journals, held in the Royal Geographical Society in London, contained detailed observations, And among those observations are descriptions that didn't fit the narrative that was developing around the Amazon at the time. Descriptions of earthworks that his survey instruments suggested were larger than any known pre-Columbian site. Descriptions of geometric arrangements that he couldn't explain. Descriptions of locations where his compass behaved abnormally. His journals were partially published, but the published version and the archival version are not identical. I've spent time comparing them. The differences are not dramatic. There are no smoking guns, no redacted paragraphs with black bars across them. The divergences are subtler than that. Phrases that appear in the archival notes don't appear in the published record. Observations about specific locations and anomalies are present in one version and absent in the other. Not censorship, necessarily. Editing happens, curation happens, but the specific observations that are consistently absent from the published record are the anomalous ones. The compass readings, the equipment descriptions, the locations where things didn't behave as expected. The silence was deafening, and Fawcett is not alone. The history of Amazon exploration is littered with accounts that were recorded, noted, filed, and then effectively vanished from the mainstream narrative. Not destroyed, you can often find them in archives, in private collections, in the footnotes of footnotes, but absent from the story we're taught, absent from the textbooks, absent from the popular consciousness. The deeper I went into this pattern, the more I noticed its consistency. It's not that the anomalous observations were challenged and dismissed. Dismissal leaves a trace. Dismissal generates debate, counter-argument, the paper trail of scientific disagreement. What happens to the Amazon anomalies is different. They're recorded, and then they're simply not followed up on, not engaged with, not incorporated into the broader framework of understanding. They're not disproven. They're absorbed. The bureaucracy of silence is more effective than outright denial. A paper written by a discredited crank invites scrutiny. A field note filed without comment invites nothing. This raises a question that I find, honestly, more unsettling than any individual anomaly. Who benefits from not asking? I need to step back, because the Amazon doesn't exist in isolation. And the pattern of acoustic anomalies, astronomical alignments, equipment failures, and deliberate disinterest I've been tracing in the basin, it echoes with uncomfortable precision in places that have nothing obviously to do with the Amazon. The ancient sites of Cambodia's Angkor complex produce infrasound signatures nearly identical to those documented at the Amazon anomaly clusters. Structural acoustic analysis published in 2015 noted this similarity and suggested it might indicate shared architectural principles. The paper received limited citation. The geoglyphs of the Nazca Plateau in Peru, drawn by a civilization that preceded the Inca, aligned with astronomical configurations, share a methodological DNA with the Amazon earthworks that conventional archaeology acknowledges and then struggles to fully explain. The coordination problem is the same. Structures spanning vast distances, aligned with a precision that implies either an extraordinary surveying capability or something that conventional archaeology hasn't yet named. The Bosnian pyramid complex, whatever its ultimate origins, and I don't wish to import that entire debate here, produces what researchers there call ultrasound beams of a frequency and coherence that its investigators argue cannot be a natural geological phenomenon. The measurements are disputed. But the measurements exist, and the debate around them follows the same pattern I've been tracing. Observation, initial engagement, then a gradual retreat into studied disinterest. And the Tartarian question, the question that has animated a generation of alternative researchers, the question of a vast civilization or network of civilizations that may have operated at a world-spanning scale before being erased from historical consciousness, sits beneath all of this like a geological stratum. Not definitively, I'm not making that claim. The evidence for a specific Tartarian empire as traditionally defined by its proponents is not what I'm presenting here. But the problem that the Tartarian framework is trying to solve, the problem of inexplicable coordination across vast distances, of architectural and acoustic sophistication that appears without obvious precursors, of systematic gaps in the historical record, that problem is real. The Amazon is not the Tartarian heartland by any traditional account, but the Amazon may be carrying the same fingerprint. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. What if the question isn't which civilization built these things? What if the question is, what kind of knowledge would you need to build them all? And where does that knowledge come from? I want to return before we close to the satellites, because this is the piece of the puzzle that shouldn't be possible to explain away. And yet, somehow it is. Somehow it gets explained away anyway. Satellite remote sensing of the Amazon basin, particularly synthetic aperture radar imaging, which can penetrate cloud cover and canopy to image the ground surface, has been in operation since the 1980s. It's an extraordinarily powerful tool. It's how we found the earthworks, how we're continuing to map the full extent of pre-Columbian infrastructure. But in the technical literature, not in popular science writing, in the actual technical literature, there are consistent references to specific zones in the Amazon where satellite data returns anomalously, not where clouds interfere, not where the canopy is too dense, zones where the data returns corrupted, where the pixel values are, in the language of remote sensing analysis, non-physical, values that shouldn't be produced by any combination of actual surface conditions. The first documented instance I found is from a 1987 NASA technical report on tropical forest imaging. A footnote notes that certain regions of the central Amazon basin consistently return anomalous backscatter values not attributable to known surface conditions. 1987. The same zones, and I've mapped them against modern satellite anomaly reports, are still returning anomalous data in 2024. Different satellites, different imaging technologies, different sensor generations, the same coordinates. The official explanation is electromagnetic interference from the ionosphere, or surface moisture anomalies, or the specific geometry of the canopy at those locations. These are reasonable hypotheses. I'm not dismissing them. But here's what I am asking. Why haven't they been resolved? If the anomaly is attributable to known physical causes, 40 years of improving satellite technology should have clarified it. We can now image the Amazon with sub-meter resolution. We can distinguish individual trees from space. We still can't get clean data from those specific coordinates. And those coordinates, I want to be very precise about this, those coordinates cluster around the same zones I've been tracking through this entire story. The earthwork sites, the acoustic anomaly clusters, the equipment failure grid, not approximately, not nearby, the same locations. I've been sitting with this story for 3 years now. 3 years of archives and field notes and conversations with researchers who speak cautiously and carefully about things they've seen that don't fit the narrative their institutions expect them to maintain. And I keep coming back to the same question. Not what was here, not who built it, not even why. What did they know? Because here's what the evidence, circumstantial, accumulating, pattern-based evidence, not proof, I want to be clear about that, what this evidence seems to suggest. Someone at some point knew something about this planet's geography that we're only beginning to rediscover. Something about acoustic physics, about astronomical alignment, about the relationship between specific locations on the Earth's surface and specific configurations in the sky. Something about what happens at particular coordinates when particular frequencies are present. And that knowledge is encoded, if it's encoded anywhere, in the architecture of places we're only now finding the tools to read. The Amazon is not a wilderness that happened to be settled. The Amazon may be a library that we've been reading as a jungle. The ayahuasca formula, that impossible, chemically precise two-plant combination that shouldn't work but does, might be a key. A technology for accessing something that the grid was designed to hold. The hum that was documented in 1925 and is still being documented today might not be an unexplained geological curiosity. It might be a carrier frequency, something transmitted, something maintained. I don't know by what, I don't know by whom. I don't know if the right framework for understanding it is technological or spiritual, or something for which we don't yet have a word. But I know that the questions cluster too consistently to be dismissed. I know that the silence around those questions is structured rather than casual. The silence of a subject that has been consistently, persistently, quietly discouraged from becoming a subject. Not banned, not censored, not forbidden, simply not asked. The deeper I went into this story, the more I came to believe that the Amazon isn't hiding a secret. The Amazon is the secret. And the strangest part, the part I keep returning to in the middle of the night when the questions won't stop, is this. The hum is still there. Every year, new researchers go in with new equipment. Every year, the acoustic anomalies persist. The equipment fails at the same coordinates. The satellites return corrupted data. The earthworks sit in their astronomical alignment, unmoved, unchanged, indifferent to our theories about them. Whatever is encoded in that forest, whatever knowledge or technology or intention is folded into its geography and its acoustics and its biochemistry, it has been there for a very long time. It was there before the explorers arrived and tried to map it. It was there before the satellites started returning data they couldn't process. It may have been there before the forest itself. And whatever it is, whatever we're missing, whatever we've been trained to look past, whatever the institutions and the literature and the bureaucracy of silence has taught us not to ask about, it is patient, more patient than we are, more patient than our questions, and it is waiting.